Yeah. Call the Finance Subcommittee meeting to order at 6:30. If the clerk could please call the roll.
Chairman Scott.
Here.
Counsel Gitchia.
Here.
Counsel Robinson.
Here.
3 present.
Thank you. Also present are Terry Ryan, our Parking Director, Austin Ball, our Deputy CFO, Connor Baldwin, our CFO, Kelly Oakes, our Auditor, and also in the audience are Councilor Vesna Noon and Councilor Paul Rathayem. We have 2 items on the agenda this evening. The first one is the parking rate discussion, continued from a prior meeting. If CFO Baldwin could provide us some information on the updates on that. Thank you.
I'd be happy to, and thank you, Madam Chair and members of the subcommittee. So this evening, we're going to give an update first on the parking enterprise and the discussion on the rates that we had back in December. We'll begin the presentation with an update on the forecast. So since we last met, we've had our retained earnings certified by the Department of Revenue for FY 2022. We've updated the forecast to include the recap numbers and adjustments that were made to set the tax rate for 2023, and we are very close with the budget, which is a separate item we will discuss after this parking discussion, but the Parking Enterprise Fund budget, part of the budget process. And you know, the forecast as we look forward over the 5-year forecast period does still look to call for a rate increase. Things have gotten slightly better, but there was a appropriation made, and so just sort of a recap or reminder that in the current fiscal year, the council appropriated $2.8 million from the stabilization fund to balance, and that shows in this enterprise fund recap on the top. It's number, well, it's got a dollar sign, number sign next to it. A tax levy subsidy of $2.8 million. And I think the question, the policy question before the subcommittee and for the council to consider is, should the Parking Enterprise Fund be self-sufficient, which is the design of enterprise fund accounting, or is there an appetite to continue a subsidy from the general fund annually? And so there is a debt service burden that is largely attributable to the Hamilton Canal Garage. But as you can see, as we move out into the later years in 2029 in the forecast, there will be some debt coming off the books related to the early garage. And so the deficit does come down. Now, we've tried to remain relatively conservative with our revenue estimates, and we are starting to see a return to normalcy, I guess I'll put it, in the on-street operation that we had much more concern in the earlier part of the fiscal year, but some of the quarterly returns and deposits from the enterprise fund are starting to see a return to normal in the on-street operation. However, there is still some concern. So I will turn it over to Mr. Ryan to give an update on some of the revenue components of the enterprise fund, namely the parking kiosks.
So we did order 142 kiosks to replace the 176 that were previously on the street. So a substantial number less than we had. 70 of those units were delivered to the early garage today. We actually brought one over to the parking office to fire up and get going and starting to use it. The remaining 72 kiosks that we expect in the next couple of weeks, and as they get delivered, we will start installing the units. We will install 15 to 18 a day. It'll take about 3 weeks to do that, and as that will be a one-for-one replacement as we move through the city to change those. And as we do that, when all of them are installed, we will start using pay by plate, not pay by space. And we will remove the numbered poles. We will remove the numbers first, and then we will remove the poles throughout the city. We will also be continuing our association with Passport. They will be collecting the mobile fees for parking on the street. They will be continue to handle our enforcement, and we'll go from there.
Next slide, Mr. Ball. This is just a map for the viewing audience and for the members of the subcommittee and the council that are here. We are looking to place the kiosks in approximately the same areas where they are now. You can see them highlighted in the purple, but we just wanted to put this up to highlight the areas where the kiosks will be installed. So we'll go right into the discussion, Mr. Ball. So on December the 15th was the last time we met. We had a number of members from the public come and give input, especially those downtown residents and users of the garages. And so we've taken all that commentary into account. We've met with the city manager to try to take a hard look at the rates and what we may be able to reduce in other areas. We may be able to make tweaks so as not to overburden. I think the overwhelming message from the residents was that we didn't want to see all of the revenue come on the backs of the downtown residents who are users of the garages. Some of them had concerns relative to parking being a service that is particular to the downtown, whereas other neighborhoods don't necessarily have the same burden. And so we've taken all of that into account, and what we have is a revised proposal for the garage rates that is one component of a multi-tiered proposal that will include a number of other revenue enhancements that we'll discuss in a moment. But to focus on the market rate and the other pass card rates, the chart on the screen lays out the current rate on the left where it says current price. So currently for the market rate, it's $104 per month. There are a number of discounts that individuals are eligible for based on their where they live or do business or their age, et cetera, or if they're students. And so what we're proposing here is an increase to the market rate from 104 to 125. That is less than what we had talked about originally, and maintaining the discounts, not exactly as they are today, but in large part they're going to be unchanged. So you'll see, there is a stepped discount for the group rate for the downtown residents. We are keeping very much the same the senior disabled rate and the Lowell High School student rate. Those look slightly different because there is a CPI adjustment that increases those rates. And so this is essentially what they pay now, Mr. Ryan. Is that correct?
Yeah, for the students currently pay $30.50, and we would bump that up to $33 it was based on a CPI index.
So a slight increase that would generate an additional $1.1 million annually in revenue for the garages. And so, next slide, Mr. Ball. The other components of the proposal mirror some things that some other municipalities do, both in the Commonwealth as well as we looked at what some New Hampshire municipalities do, Portsmouth namely, to try to introduce dynamic pricing. And I think that is a concept that many are familiar with, but it is something that we would have to make some adjustments to the ordinance in order to allow for different prices during different times of the day. And so there would be certain times of the day where parking may be more expensive, and we would narrow that down and classify that by zones. So I'll turn it over to Mr. Ryan to more fully explain the proposal, but that would be an additional revenue enhancement for the enterprise.
The goal of the dynamic pricing would be to help move people along. Currently, we have most of our spaces are 2 hours. We do not allow meter feeding, and that is a violation. What we would look to is with dynamic pricing, your first hour would be $1.50, your second would be $1.50, which is the current rate, and then after that, if you chose to stay longer, the rates would increase, maybe to $3 an hour or $4 an hour. And so you could end up, if you wanted to park on, say, Merrimack Street, if that was a designated zone, it could cost you $27, $30 thereabouts to park there for the day. And if you chose to do that, well, you chose to do that. And that would help, a lot of the turnover, I think, on Merrimack Street. And I think that would be something, we're not changing the rates for the 2 hours, but we are affecting the rates if you do stay longer. And that could be something that would be helpful possibly on Market, Middle, Central Street, and possibly up around Canal and Jackson Street up around, near the courthouse. And with the new kiosks, there will be multiple zones. The city will not only be Zone 501, it will be, depending on the street, that'll be your zone. So we will be able to control that zone and adjust the rates from the office for those particular zones.
And so, at its basis, the new kiosk technology unlocks a number of new potential options for the city that were not available to us with the old kiosks. And so, the dynamic pricing, as Mr. Ryan explained and as we've discussed here, is one of those options, and we can employ that for a certain event. Parking rates during special events downtown. But the idea or the concept from a policy perspective is to try to encourage parkers to park in the garages. And so the main way that you're able to do that is to price it accordingly. So if it's more expensive to park on the street in front of the destination you want to park, but it's cheaper in the garage, but you're willing to walk, then you'll migrate towards the garage. If you're willing to pay to park in front of where you want to park, then that's a choice that an individual is able to make, and that is it's a well-established policy that many municipalities use, and that is something that we're looking and trying to get some input from the subcommittee and from the council as to whether there's an appetite for that in Lowell.
Okay. I think we all have some questions on it, so if you don't mind opening up for questions, Councilor Robinson.
Thank you. First, I'd just like to say I like the way you're approaching the increase. Seems somewhat reasonable, but question that I have with the dynamic pricing, and we're trying to encourage people to utilize garages, and if they choose not to, would there be a way that somebody that would be registered handicap placard or something would have a different rate than just general public in a location like that, if it was deemed like a high-value zone?
So a handicap parker, if they have the placard hanging on their windshield, they do not pay for parking on the street, and they would continue not to pay. They would have to enter their license plate number, and once we get it set up and they register it, they would not be charged.
Okay, thank you. Excellent. And so with the rate increase, I agree, to try to put this on the people that are using the parking to offset what we're looking for. The advertising possibilities with the kiosks, I know we've mentioned briefly, and that's probably going to take some time, I'd imagine, to really look into.
And do not expect Las Vegas marquee screens. It'll be a small message. It's a small screen. It's only about that big. So there will be some kind of message, but, we're still working on how that will work.
So just to expand on that, so who will be developing like that plan around that, around marketing?
Well, I am working
You're
with
working on
Diandra and Melissa out of the manager's office and Case. They've been down to see the kiosks. They've seen the videos of it, so we are working on a marketing plan to get this out and to show people how to use the kiosks. Now that we have one in the office, as soon as I figure it out, I'm going to train the 3 enforcement officers that I have out in the street, and they will be my ambassadors to help people who are struggling on the street. And I expect that to happen 2 to 3 weeks out on the street, helping and assisting people on using the app if there's a question, and the new kiosks.
And then you'll be working on the dynamic pricing plan too, like for how we're going to price for events and...
Currently, there's an event pricing, it's already set up in the ordinances, and we typically charge, we can set that up based on, if we could get the old kiosks to work, there was already a setup for that. So we would go back and go back to the Lowell Memorial Auditorium area or the Songus streets and the Spinner Stadium streets, and we will be able to take those streets as individual zones and set them to the event rate of maybe $15 for Lowell Memorial Auditorium parking on East Merrimack Street. And we'd work with Laz to set up that and use the current pricing structures we use now and just put them on the street. But we could also, and I plan on putting some temporary handicap spaces across from the auditorium in front of the old Jarvis property. That's been a request for some of the shows at the auditorium. So we'll be able to do things like that.
I actually have more questions, but I'll wait for, you don't mind? Okay. My other question is about the pay-by-plate system that you said we're going to. How are we going to get information out to residents? Because I know that I'm familiar with this system, pretty familiar with it, that if you move from one parking spot to another parking spot within the same zone, hours later, the system's going to read your plate as being there for the entire time, if you're within that zone.
You would pay for, specific amount of hours in that zone. If you paid for 2 hours, you can park anywhere on that zone. Okay, you can move your car, but you will get hit if you stay longer than the 2.
Right.
But the city ordinance says that right now you have to move streets after 2 hours.
Right, but this system is much more efficient at catching people that
This will
do not
be.
move within the 2 hours. So I'm just
Right.
saying to get that out there, to let people know that if you park within the same zone for more than 2 hours,
You will get caught.
you will get caught with the
Yes,
system, because
you
it will
will.
automatically transmit the plate,
It
tell the
will.
officer to write the ticket out.
And we will have that officer as close as possible to issue that ticket.
Okay, and then my other question is, we reduce the number of kiosks.
Yes.
Where are you planning on reducing the locations, just randomly, sporadically throughout?
No, we walked the streets, and we walked with Flowbird, the vendor, and we had like Suffolk Street had 10 kiosks on it over by Wanalancet Mills. We had already taken 3 of those and put them over at the new courthouse. Okay, so we did remove a few more over there. We removed a few from Cabot Street, where we had multiple kiosks. Hall Street, we don't need them. We didn't need that many over there, and we were going to put one up on Pawtucket Street up by Fox Hall because Lowell wanted to add spaces up there, and they said, no, let the kids use the app. And so we didn't put one there. So we've gone around, we've kept the kiosks downtown pretty much intact because they're busy, and we don't want to have people walk that far.
Yeah, that makes a
Okay,
lot of
so,
sense.
but in the outer fringes and up by Lowell, we did thin them out.
And then just one more again, the forecast, you have in the recap this year's, the tax levy funding that we use towards it, and it doesn't show it in the years going forward. Is that you're not planning on subsidizing the parking enterprise fund in years going forward?
That's an excellent question. So in 2023, the 2.8 million, yes, was a subsidy from the tax levy. The operating deficit that we're projecting for 2024, we do have sufficient retained earnings in the parking enterprise to cover that. Now, it is often the case between the time we set the budget to when we get to the recap, which is in the fall right before the Christmas break time. We may have better revenue collections than we've projected, and oftentimes that allows us to reduce that number. But for next year, our safeguard is that there are at least enough retained earnings to cover next year's operating deficit. So it likely will not require an additional either appropriation from stabilization or tax levy subsidy. So we're not planning for that in the 2024 operating budget. However, if all of that comes to pass in 2024 and we use the balance of the retained earnings, then by the time we get to 2025, that $2.3 million deficit will need to be built into the 2025 budget. Or the alternative being some other available fund will need to subsidize it, meaning it could be another appropriation from stabilization with the caveat that we will pay it back with free cash the next year. But it's not the best way to manage the parking enterprise. It is intended to be self-sufficient. And so by the time we get to 2025, if we're able to implement, one, the increase to the pass card rates, two, additional collections, perhaps from the on-street operation, it may not be as bad by the time we get there. But what we're showing now is by the time we get to 2025, we will need to have some subsidy either by the tax levy or by the stabilization fund.
Thank you. Councilor Robinson, you had another question?
Thank you. If we're looking subsidies or we're looking for additional revenue streams to offset this, I know that they did try a pilot. They did permit out one of the tops of the garages not too long ago as a venue location. Maybe that's something that we start to look more to help offset and bring in an additional revenue stream. Councilor Scott and myself did put a motion together a while ago looking into potential advertising options utilizing the buildings. And one thing that I'm seeing some communities are moving to because of you don't have to screw, drill, any of that, is using lights to advertise using lighting on the surface of the buildings. So maybe that's another potential idea down the line. Last thing, you mentioned there's 3 enforcement officers. I thought that I remember you told us that we did have the admin position or the front office position was approved. Where are we in that to get that 4th person out on the street? Because I don't know what kind of revenue are we losing, especially before we roll out the kiosks, by being down an enforcement officer.
Okay.
So it's an excellent segue and a very good question, Counselor. We are looking to add additional enforcement positions into the fiscal year 2024 budget. We are about to get into some of the budget discussion here, but that administrative position needs an ordinance. And so the council would need to bring an ordinance, all of which are parts of our FY 2024 budget proposal. So additional enforcement and collection are part of our projections for the forecast. Does that answer your question?
Not really, because I thought there's 4 funded enforcement officers over there currently, and 1 is being utilized for administrative duties.
Yes.
So we're down a funded enforcement officer, and as a result, I'm asking, what kind of revenue are we losing being down that 1 enforcement officer that we're not technically down? It's funded.
I get what you're saying, Counselor, and that is a very good point. It's about $100,000 per enforcement. That's a very rough back-of-the-napkin calculation, but if you take the on-street revenue and divide it by the number of, strike that, the parking ticket revenue and divide it by the number of individuals we have writing those tickets, they're each worth about $100,000 gross in revenue. Now, you net out the salary costs, but they are all revenue positive, each one of those positions, and that is why in the FY 2024 budget we'll be adding additional positions on the streets.
But and so do you see what I'm asking?
Yep.
We have 4 currently funded.
Mm-hmm.
You're looking to add above and beyond the 4 that we have funded and the admin position, or?
Yes,
Yes.
that is correct.
Okay.
The other additional ones would be different shifts to cover the ordinances that are out in the streets now up to 10 o'clock at night, and, covering the enforcement that currently is till 6 p.m. So there are gaps in our day that I have to fill.
Okay, so that'll provide more coverage. And the last question, have you considered Couple Square? I know the city has that lot in the back of there. Is that a pay-to-park situation over there, or is it not?
Yes, it is. It's Leroy Lot. We have a kiosk up there, and the kiosk works, and we will be putting a new kiosk there.
Excellent, thank you.
I'd also just like to recognize my colleagues, Councilor Mercier and Councilor Rourke, present. Councilor Getchia.
Through you, Madam Chair, to CFO Baldwin. Back on December 15th of 2022, we had much more information on how these accounts were actually doing with the revenues that were given to us early in advance so that we could see and kind of quantify what the projections were for each of those accounts. And at that time, we saw like the AOT was going to be negative 55% at the end of the year if you did the calculation out. And there were, most of those accounts, except for the early garage, were showing they were going to be negative of funding that was projected at that time, that number. What has changed that much that you're still sticking to your initial budget projections in every one except for the on-street parking, which we can see that went down about 800,000 roughly. I'm sorry, it went down 300,000. So basically, when you look at this, the deficits here, you got a $3.6 million deficit, and at that time we were projecting a $3.3 million. So we have more of a deficit now, but we're projecting that we're going to be everywhere else except for the CID garage, which has actually gone up, and that actually is going to trigger a conversation in a minute. But most of these, if you looked at those numbers back then, we're going to project deficits. How are we going to hit our mark now on all of these spots from that December to the end of June? How and now are we going to capture these amounts as outlined in the recap?
So we budget the revenues for the enterprise fund as a whole. And so right now we are on track. We've collected $7.3 million of the revised budget. Now this is setting aside the tax levy subsidy that's listed here because that was a direct appropriation, but we're $7.3 million of $7.7 million revised. And I certainly take to heart your commentary about each one, but they are not their own enterprise. We look at the system as a whole. And so we are still projecting life to return to normal and haven't quite seen that yet. And that is the basis for the forecast. But each year, as we realize actual collections, we will adjust and amend the forecast if that does not come to pass. But your point is well taken, Councilor.
Yeah, the only information we have is you set them out as their own, as a collection, so that would be through the auditor. Obviously, you got this money coming in for AOT, this money coming in for Downs or the Davison. But the other thing that's concerning is after Councilor Scott had asked the question about the tax levy subsidy, and you said no going forward, but even if we look in the budget going to 24, 25, and this may be that you haven't factored in the adjustment rates for what you're proposing, but you're still looking at, even in 2024, a $2.2 million deficit between operations and revenue. So that's a lot of money to make up within it. And I'm sure you did your numbers, and hopefully those numbers are running the other way. But the Hamilton Canal District garage is a huge jump to $750,000 from the projection when we looked back in the 2022, the December one. You projected it was going to be $160,000 all the way out to 2028. And now we're projecting from 2024 that it's going to jump up to $750,000. How are we going to find that revenue down there? Or is this just a placeholder saying, because if that number's heavy.
That is the revenue that parking garage should be collecting, based on the number of spaces, and that is what we need to fill that garage.
I'd like the word should.
Yes.
And that's what my issue is when we start projecting out. These are should projections, not reality projections, because I understand what you're saying, and if we can develop in that area and it does what we were asking for, that revenue should be there. But that's not happening right now. And we just gave $1 million TIF to a garage that now is like in the heart of our revenue source for this. So that to me is always the challenge when we look at these pieces. And I just think that we may be more aggressive on our revenue sources than reality. And I think that Councilor Scott is probably more right than wrong at this point on the revenue source piece, but the kiosks may change that and send people into the garages is what you guys are proposing to do, and it may change that whole thing. But either way, we're top heavy on one and not the other, because if there's on-street parking now goes into a garage, that number should see a dip where the garages should see the increase, unless we have unless it invites more people in because they see a front spot open, which that's what we would hope would happen, and both would be a driver to go the other way. But I do caution the forecast, because I don't want people to think that, this is 100% when we're all looking at, these are should-be revenues, not reality of what we're seeing from the past. And I'd like to make a motion that we actually get the revenue to date for each one of these garages, just so that we can compare where we're going to end up at the end of the year and how these projections are close to what your analysis is. I believe your analysis is probably spot on. You'll probably see that maybe the early garage is taken off, and we'll see less down at maybe the Davison lot, or down more so the John Street lot, or something like that. You'll see it will be less, and one's going to make up for the other. But I just would be, I just wonder how we get other people to like the Warren Street garage, or is that something we truly look at trying to sell off to either Middlesex Community College or the UMass Lowell, and trying to say, this is a revenue eater, we just need, and they're the user of it, and maybe there's something that can be worked out that way, because it's really not something that most residents drive down to that one garage. And it may be something that we look at to say, okay, is there a way that we can relieve the residents of this infrastructure and still have an option to use it that way? So I do like the report, and I think that going forward, I'll be interested in seeing these revenue projections, as Councilor Scott brought up with, are we going to have to still subsidize? But I do like that we're finally replacing those kiosks, because that's the call that we get every day. Thank you.
Yeah, motion on the floor. You want a second?
Second the motion on the floor.
All in favor? Aye. Get a copy of those reports for everybody. I just did have a few more questions. A resident had brought forward to me about the timing of the app, that you can't feed the app early in the morning, like before a certain time. The meters don't start until a certain time.
The parking starts at 8 o'clock, so no, you can't pay until 8 o'clock.
So for all the people whose normal shift is 7 to 3, which is very typical, is there any way that we could extend those hours out?
I can absolutely, I'm sure we can do something with that. We've just
Because we're losing
historically
revenue
not done
too
it.
for that hour,
But,
probably. Yeah.
well, they could start, we could set it up so they could start paying at 7:30 for 8 o'clock. So if they're in the spot before 8, we're not checking, but they're there and they're good. So I can look into that, yes.
Okay. And just one other question that was asked is about the 100,000 per enforcement officer. Is that something, have we looked to see how we compare to other towns at all? Cities, whether or not that's a standard amount that they normally collect, if we could look at that, just to make sure that we're, keeping that in check. And also, does that include tow revenues in that 100,000 per?
No, the tow revenue belongs to the general fund.
Councilor Robinson?
So if an enforcement officer initiates a tow, that's not factored into, see, I'm not saying where does the money go? Is that figure, the average figure that generated from tows from our enforcement officers, is that factored into that 100,000 or no? So can I put a motion on the floor to get an accurate representation of what does each enforcement officer generate between tows and enforcement annually? And I know that's going to vary, but I think it'd be good to see, because when we start looking budget season and add and expand it on enforcement, at least it gives us an idea of return on investment, so to say, if you're looking financially at it.
Okay, and a motion on the floor. You want a second, Councilor Getchia?
Second.
All in favor, aye?
Aye.
Bring that forward. And I don't know, do you have any additional questions, or should we move to the second item on the agenda, the budget update? Okay. CFO Baldwin, if you could move on to that item, thank you.
Of course, and thank you again, Madam Chair. So on the screen here, and just to start things off, we had a great discussion about this at one of the recent council meetings. We just want to provide an update and answer some additional questions. The timeline, we have begun our meetings with department level staff, department heads and their budget staff, and we are still on target to bring a balanced budget and a loan order for the capital plan to the City Council on May 23rd, 2023. So just to dive into some of the updates on challenges and highlights, these are all the same things that we discussed at that meeting, the council meeting recently. The fixed costs are the major drivers of the budget. And by fixed costs, I'm talking about pension and health insurance. We had a lengthy discussion about health insurance at the last council meeting, but there has been an increase at the GIC. The GIC has made some changes to some of the plans, so some of the plans are no longer open to new enrollees, and so that is forcing some behavior. Some folks will be migrating to more costly plans, both for the individual employee as well as to the employer, and so we're trying to anticipate some of those changes. Open enrollment is happening right now, but those changes will take effect for the next fiscal year. And so charter schools is another increase that we've discussed at length. The personnel costs, we are in the last year of the collective bargaining agreements with our various union partners, and there is a 2.5% across the board cost of living adjustment, as well as other provisions of the various collective bargaining agreements for some of the covered personnel. The debt service increase, related to various outstanding capital projects to the tune of about $450,000. So highlights, and not to get ahead of the city manager or the discussion we will have when we bring the budget forward, but some of the things that we're trying to focus on are reorganization of some of the departments, namely some changes that the manager is negotiating with some of the public works employees, an expansion of the co-op team. A lot of this is taking into account some of the opportunities that are available to us with ARPA, but trying to be mindful of the fact that that is a short-lived opportunity, that we have, we are trying to focus those monies on one-time capital-like expenditures, but for things in the public health realm or one of the other eligible costs is rebuilding the public sector workforce. And so we are taking advantage of some of those, but trying not to overburden ourselves so that when the ARPA eligibility period has expired, that we have to absorb a large amount of personnel costs at that time in 2026. So one example of that is an expansion of the co-op team in the health department to address some of the substance abuse and homelessness issues. Increase in public safety overtime is something we're budgeting for in the next year in police, but the largest component of that is in fire to continue the policy of keeping all the companies open. We are looking to implement and stand up a 311 department. So we're going to need personnel. It is slated to be a fully functional 311 system. That will operate very much like many folks will be familiar with in other communities. It is in essence a call center, but it will be a single point of contact for residents to call in work orders or requests for services to the city to one central contact. For many years, and for the many years that I've been here, it is often a challenge for individuals who don't know where to go to get the service that they want or don't know who to call. And so they have to go through a series of, calling the treasurer's office, to be transferred over to the assessor's office, and I'm using an example I'm familiar with. They need an abatement for their motor vehicle excise, or maybe it's an issue with their water bill, and so they call the treasurer's office. So 311 would be the single point of contact, as well as for issues of potholes being filled or your curb needs some repair. It would be one single number to City Hall. And so in order to stand that up, we will need some costs to be covered for employee salaries as well as some equipment, et cetera. So the next item or highlight is in education. We are looking, and I'll go into sort of the net school spending component in a couple of slides, but our total funding for the schools for next year is $242.2 million. We are looking to expand some of the library services to support the bookmobile, which is expected to be delivered soon, and we will need to staff that in order to have programming to put the bookmobile in some of the neighborhoods and bring some of the programming and the educational opportunities into the neighborhoods. There is going to be some expanded code enforcement, so we're looking to add additional sanitary code enforcement officers and building inspectors to continue the council's initiative for neighborhood improvements, as well as some various other support staff and public safety to support the body camera program in the Lowell Police Department. So, as we sit here tonight, we have received, and we talked about this before, but we received all the requests from the department, and the deficit was approximately $20 million. If we were to fund everything that everybody asked for in their 2024 budget requests. We have currently arrived at a balanced budget, and but at this point in the process, we will now meet with all of the departments, give them an opportunity to take a look at the manager's revision of their budget and tell us where it may not be possible to do the things that we expect from them. And so there's still a little bit of push and pull that is required at this point, and so we may need to add things back to budgets if we're told, you can't cut this because of these fixed costs that maybe you didn't take into account. And so once we finish with the departmental hearings, we'll have a balanced budget to discuss with the council. So we do, as part of our assumptions, have a use of stabilization to mitigate the tax impact. That is a continuation of a trend where we are going to appropriate a certain amount from stabilization, and we will, as we have in many of the past years, replenish that amount with free cash when it is certified. We are also projecting a pretty aggressive new growth projection into the 2024 budget, and that is based on some of the personal property increases that we've seen over the last few years in the assessor's office. Some of it is attributable to new growth, just new development happening in Lowell, some of the new residential or commercial developments, but as well, it is also some of the TIFs that are outstanding that are declining. So we have existing TIFs for some commercial enterprises where they're either for personal property or for real estate, where we're starting to see that exemption decline, and so that new growth is being realized in the tax levy. Just switching over for a minute to the capital plan, all of the requests for capital updates and for project requests are due on Friday, at which time we will be busy preparing the update to the capital plan. And as we've talked about with this finance subcommittee previously, we are in the middle of a comprehensive update to the capital plan with the Collins Center that was funded by a grant through the Community Compact in the governor's office. So, realizing we're short on time, this will be the final slide.
A couple questions.
Happy to
real
pause
quick.
for questions.
Council Robinson?
Thank you. Do you think the mentioned reorg will occur pre-budget to see how that impacts that area of the budget before it's presented to the council? First question. Second question, the fiscal highlights, FY24, long-term inheritance is, I'd imagine, is minimal compared to if it's created with ARPA. So the long-term inheritance, we're not looking to create, and put ourselves in a fiscal deficit moving forward because of the creation, I'd imagine. And also, with the 311, do you know if there's a option for community partners to be plugged in to the 311 system as well? So like LPS or CTI or any of the services provided where a resident accesses 311 and they are routed to those kind of services as well? Not initially, but long term. Would that be something you think would be doable? Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor, and through you, Madam Chair. Your third question about 311, I think that is certainly a possibility, and one of the benefits of having a central point of contact where, these individuals that will be answering the phone and will be interfacing with the public will have access to at least awareness of all of the resources. And one of the limitations of calling an individual department is that they are experts in their subject matter. They know if you call the finance office, they know about finance or treasury or assessing or the DPW, but they may not have awareness of everything. And so we're going to try to train these people to have a very broad understanding of the organization, but that will include our community partners. And so I expect, much like, and I'll put the city manager's office sort of separately because these are calls that we get every day in the city manager's office for people who call because it's the main number for City Hall, but they're looking for the registry of deeds, or they're calling because they have a matter that should be before the courts. And we don't turn those people away. Belle and Leticia in the city manager's office, they'll take the time to research it on the internet. If they need to talk to the register of deeds because they have a land issue, they'll point them in the right direction, give them some assistance, and we were going to mirror that. We are going to mirror that with the 311. So we expect that whoever it is they call with whatever it is question they have, they're going to get some help and they're going to get pointed to the right resource. So your other question about long-term liabilities associated with ARPA, yes, we are trying to limit those. We're trying to be very careful so as not to overly burden for salary costs, but also for OPEB and pension costs associated with those employees we bring on board. And then your first question about the DPW reorg, yes, there are certain components of that are in negotiation now that we're going to bring forward. These have been motions by the City Council. They have been requests. One such request, there's a transfer on tonight's council agenda to fund one of the requests that's come to us from the Lowell High School project team, and that is to have a dedicated individual at the high school to manage the building systems, manage certain aspects of the facility. So yes, we are going to have to bring components of that plan forward now, but I think the manager's intention is to bring the full package along with the budget to have a more full and active discussion about it at budget time.
Thank you very much.
Continue with the net school spending discussion. I did just have one quick question, comment on the, it's not in here, but on the cherry sheet, you had the charter school projection, or I think it was FY24 was quite a bit higher than it is included on this. How does that work as far as it just came in lower from the state? Is that what happened? They underfunded the account again? The charter school?
I'm sorry, you're talking about the assessment or the reimbursement?
The reimbursement.
The reimbursement is a mirror from what was released with the governor's budget on the cherry sheet, the other side of the cherry sheet, the assessments. Is your question about a number that was included in a projection previously?
Yeah, I'll bring it forward
Okay.
to it another time.
That is a changing number, and we expect when, I think it may be tomorrow, but when the House releases its budget, that number is going to change again because it is subject to the deliberative process at the state level. So we will go through a series of changes between now, and Lowell is particularly susceptible to changes in the charter school reimbursement as well as the assessment. And that is for the projection for next year. There is also a true-up that happens within the year based on the enrollment figures. So there, just like for the public schools, there's a charter school true-up that, and I'm not an expert in this, but bear with me, in October, and it is often the case where the amount we pay in the last couple of months within a fiscal, so FY 2023, for example, is a less monthly amount than we were paying at the beginning of the year because it gets trued up through the state based on the enrollments. Does that address your question?
Yes.
Okay. And so finally, Madam Chair, through you, the net school spending figure for 2024, we have on a chart in front of you. And so just to walk through 2022, we're always a year behind in the compliance. So we submit our compliance reports through the Lowell Public Schools to DESE to be certified, but we're always looking forward to the next year as we're budgeting. And so for 2022, the actual spending in 2022 is $241.3 million. We exceeded the net school spending requirement by $8.6 million in 2022. That is above where we were, but it has been in and around that amount for a few years now, and is a demonstration of the City Council's commitment to education. The 2023 required spending was $257.8 million. When the DESE certifies the prior year compliance figures, they release a projected budgeted amount. So if you were to look at that compliance report, it shows us as beating, quote unquote, beating the net school spending requirement by just over $500,000. But that projection is incredibly conservative because it does not take into account the increases in fixed costs. So if you were to look at the 2022 projection, it would be much less than the $8 million. So we expect that 575 to be closer to $1 or $2 million in excess. But it is an indication to the city that we can't level fund. We have to continue to increase our local contribution, and that is what we're including in the 2024 budget. So in the proposed budget, we will be proposing an increase to the local contribution that is equal to the municipal revenue growth factor. That is a calculation that the Department of Revenue comes up with that calculates the increase. It's applicable to all cities and towns of your local receipt growth over the last few years. The number is 3.9%, so we will be increasing our local contribution to the schools by 3.9%, and our 2024 proposed funding amount is $242.2 million. Now, the 2024, and I realize this is very esoteric, the 2024 required spending based on the net school spending formula is $288.8 million with a $60.1 million local contribution. We expect with the $242.2 million, now that includes the Chapter 70 education funding in it, plus what I'm calling the local contribution, plus the maintenance of effort charges. These are for, I know the subcommittee is well aware of what they are, but for the folks at home, the increase to fixed costs for teachers, retired teachers' health insurance, retired school employee pension costs, as well as DPW costs in support of the schools, plowing of schools, et cetera, we do expect we will exceed the net school spending requirement in 2024. So with that, I'll conclude the presentation, and if there's any additional questions, myself and the team are happy to answer.
Councilor Getchia?
I asked most of mine at the last council meeting, so I don't really have many. I just, when you speak of the budget presentation on May 23rd, if there's any way that the council could see that presentation maybe 2 weeks in advance so that we have something to go on long before the presentation, because it takes a long time to go through it. If there's a way that we can see it earlier than what we normally see it, it would be helpful, at least to me, and I'm not sure about, I would say the rest of the council also, just to have it, would be able to scrub through it, because I think that your work needs to be brought out even further, and I think that through this time, we're seeing more and more information that we're gathering, and you see just the charter school, the $4 million that we were told that it was going to cost us. And if we're going to increase by 2.5% roughly the tax base, 2.4 of it would just be for that one piece. So I just think that if we get it earlier, there's more of a discussion that can happen, and maybe it will cut down on the questions during budget hearings. I hope. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Isn't any questions? No? Yeah, motion to adjourn.
Second.
All in favor? Motion adjourned.